not used to starting early and, having a good friend to introduce me as well as a good colleague. I'm going to do a quick tech change here while we get started. I want to add my welcome to the United States to OWASPA, and particularly to our international friends who have traveled to the United States. I just want to say that it is my great pleasure and luxury to not have to talk about policy or American politics today, although that might be the most entertaining talk I could possibly give. You've arrived at, as you know, quite an interesting time in our American political process here. Let's see. There we go. Gratuitous picture of my child playing soccer. There we go. And Keynote. There we go, perfect. Thank you. Thanks again, Lars, and thanks for putting up with that little tech change. Mac users are sometimes, as those of you who are Mac users, we're really kind of stubborn and don't change our stripes very easily. Thank you to Mark and to the program committee from OWASPA for giving me the privilege of being the opening speaker at this conference today. OWASPA is a phenomenal organization and one that I have been so pleased to partner with and to play some small role in helping to support over the last 8 years. And what I'd like to do to open the conference this morning is, I'm at my last slide, aren't I? That's not where I want to be. Let's try that again. And go to the beginning. There we go. So what I wanted to do this morning was to take a bit of time to talk about something that we at SPARC have been spending a great deal of time lately working through internally and also with lots of our collaborators and partners in the space, including many of you who are in this room today. And that is taking a really hard look at where we are today in open access as a movement, both strategically and operationally, and really digging into the challenges that we're facing in continuously being asked to both hone and to harmonize our focus on where it is that we want to go as individuals, as organizations, collaboratively, and collectively as a movement. I'd like to take some time to offer a few observations on the status quo in the open access movement from my perspective and SPARC's perspective, and also to put out some thoughts about some strategies, some structures, some frameworks that we've been exploring that might be helpful in helping us to collectively and collaboratively accelerate our progress towards our goals as a movement. And I really want to emphasize that at its heart, open access, the open access movement is a social change movement. And that's a really important thing that I think we sometimes forget on a day-to-day basis. We really do fit the mold. We were formed to be a social change movement. And when we think about a social change movement, there's very specific definitions of social movements, and we certainly fill the basic requirements. We're definitely a loosely organized group of individuals and organizations with a passionate shared concern for changing a specific aspect of the status quo. And more particularly and more specifically, we're a group of individuals and organizations who do more than just talk about creating that change. And that has been the case since the inception of the open access movement. Early on in 2001, well, before 2001, there was a growing recognition throughout many stakeholder communities within the academy, within the research community, that there were real serious problems with the system of scholarly communication. And in 2001, the Soros Foundation convened a small group of very diverse representatives of this sort of multitude of stakeholder groups who got together to not only to try to define what those problems were, but also to try to recast this as an opportunity for creating something collectively better together. And the thing that we worked, or that the Budapest Open Access Initiative, as it became known, was working or identified as the opportunity, was really this convergence of the old tradition of scholars and researchers freely and willingly sharing the results of the work that they're generating combined with the phenomenal new delivery and communication and workspace mechanism of the internet, coming together to do something specific, to create an unprecedented and new public good. And this notion of the public good at the center of the open access movement is something that I think is really critical for us to take the time to remember and to have at the center and to keep at the center of the work that we're doing. The public good that was defined during the Budapest Open Access Initiative is something we're all familiar with, and that is the worldwide, free, immediately accessible, and fully reusable availability of journal articles, peer-reviewed literature, to anybody, anywhere, anytime who wants to use it, right? This public good is the definition of open access. And it really doesn't, as Paul really, I think, said quite effectively, it doesn't take more than a glance around this room to understand that since the BOAI brought people together to define this term of open access and to launch the movement to open access, that we've come an incredibly long way, and that there's no denying that open access as a concept, as a philosophy, and as an acting principle has really arrived. Paul noted the growth of open access articles. By any objective measure that you look at in the open access movement, whether it's the number of articles carrying open licenses, the number of open access journals that are available to us, the number of policies at research institutions, in universities, in higher ed institutions, in funders, whether it's the number of repositories, we look at it and we see that there has been tremendous growth. And we see that this growth is not slowing down, right? It's accelerating growth, right? We sometimes feel that it's taking off like wildfire. Sometimes it feels slow. It's sort of this weird, I don't know, push me, pull you dichotomy, I think, of any time you're in the middle of a movement like this, we're gonna see lots of these sort of paradoxes. And the growth is great. There's no denying that. I think we're all very happy to see things moving in this direction. But I think when we're honest, we also have to say that this growth, and particularly the acceleration in growth in the last several years, brings with it a real increase in complexity in the environment that we're trying to operate in as individuals, again, and as part of a social change movement. And that's largely because of the diversity, which is wonderful, but it does present complexity in terms of the types of stakeholders that we have. Each of these stakeholder groups, and I will count SPARC as a library membership organization as, we're sort of a typical representative of organization in one stakeholder community. We tend to focus and have sort of interim or short-term goals. We might not necessarily always be thinking about promoting a research communications ecosystem with the public good at its core on a daily basis. For libraries, we may be thinking about promoting open access because we're trying to alleviate the pressure on our collection development budgets that rising subscriptions have. If we're a researcher, we may not be focused on a day-to-day basis on that larger public good, but rather on our interim or sub-goal of getting our paper out to the widest audience of readers, getting citations. Funders may be focused on generating the largest return for investment on their research portfolio by making sure that the results are distributed widely. These are all fantastic goals. They all feed into the larger goal of the open access movement of this public good. But they sometimes have us feel like they're running in different channels, they're running in ways that are a bit chaotic, that it's uncontrolled, and sometimes we worry that it's actually uncontrollable, that one goal will eclipse another, or that one stakeholder group will run too fast towards something that doesn't seem to be exactly in line with the goal that our portion of stakeholders are looking to achieve in the open access movement. And I think we hear often, and if we're honest, we sometimes fear that this kind of chaos, this sort of uncontrolled, running in different directions, could cause the movement to fail. And indeed, we've heard in the past that we have failed to a certain extent. Claudio Espese, who's here in the audience somewhere today, 2 years ago gave a keynote talk at this meeting that stayed with me. And it stayed with me for a variety of reasons. One was that Claudio's talk focused specifically on the lack of impact that the open access movement had had to date on large commercial stock values. And that's a legitimate measure of one community's view of the success or failure of the open access movement. If I'm a financial analyst, or if my goal of the open access movement for my community was really to see that the open access movement would supplant commercial publishers to the extent that their value in the marketplace would go down, then by any objective measure that Claudio showed us with his slides, we haven't achieved that goal. In fact, commercial stockholder or share prices have gone up for Elsevier and Wiley, which were the two companies that Claudio analyzed and showed us the slides from. So we really could have walked out of that meeting feeling like we have failed. But what I realized that Claudio's example was actually a perfect example of focusing on one measure of success and sort of one stakeholder community view of success, and that we were all sort of falling into, or vulnerable of falling into the trap of doing that on a fairly regular basis. Claudio's talk stuck with me for another reason. It was also really important to me personally and professionally, because he specifically made the point that he was focusing on the single measure because that was his task as a financial analyst, but also because he honestly didn't know what the larger goal of the open access movement was. And this is somebody who has been from not an strictly outsider, but somewhat of an outsider position, really interested in the open access movement, talking with all of us for years on a regular basis. And he didn't feel that we were able to articulate our collective goal, or we weren't articulating our collective goal clearly enough that he could really see it clearly. And that really stuck with me because I walked out of that room feeling like if we didn't get our act together and really work on being able to do that, we potentially could see the movement going in the direction of failure. So that was scary, but we're still here. And why are we still here? I think we're here because we certainly, despite looking at some measures, we haven't achieved our goals yet, but I don't think we failed as a movement. And in fact, I don't think we're doomed to failure as a movement. And I, in fact, think, and would like to talk a little bit about, that the facts point in the opposite direction. The chaos, the growth, the relentless pace of new entrants into our community, the challenges, the feeling of competition, these are signals to me that our movement is very much alive and vibrant and is really simply struggling through a temporary and very predictable phase in the normal evolution and development of a social change movement. Right? The reason I wanted to emphasize the open access movement as a social change movement is that we can really track. We're not alone in trying to change a specific element of the society that we collectively are responsible for building. If you look at the stages of social movements, you can clearly see the open access movement went through the emergence phase with the BOAI. We've gone through a period of coalescence where we've kind of all come together and adopted reasonably cohesive definitions of open access. And I would argue that we're somewhere towards the end of this bureaucratization phase. And again, if we look around the room, think about bureaucratization, what it means is putting in formal organizational structures to support the movement, loosely affiliated. Many of the organizations that we each represent in this room did not exist before the advent of the open access movement, and many were in fact formed to help support the end goals of that movement. So that's great. We can kind of see this predictable development of social movements. And is it any wonder that things feel chaotic, that things feel like there are a whole bunch of different directions that we might go in the movement, including failure where we are now? Well, yes, look at our next options. We have 5 potential sort of structures for options of where we could potentially end up with the movement, ranging from failure to co-option to repression, the depressing ones. Going mainstream, that might be a good one. But for me, it's the top. I'd like to see us get to the top goal. And I'm betting that we as a movement and we as individuals and as organizations within the movement are all aiming for success, right? Not a secret, probably not a surprise. The important thing for us to really be able to understand and to articulate is, what does success actually mean to us? And I go back to Claudio's talk for that. If we can't articulate our shared goal of what it is that the open access movement is out to achieve, then our chances of getting out of that bureaucratization phase and into the happy place of success are diminished. Yes, so what does that success actually mean to us? The more that we've spent time talking with partners, with collaborators, talking internally with the staff at SPARC, talking with our members, I think we go back to the BOAI's ultimate discussion and opportunity of the creation of this new public good, right? Of putting this at the center of what it is that we're trying to build. It's this notion of everything in our research and scholarly communications ecosystem realigned around the mechanisms, the norms, and the behaviors that support a commons where the guiding principle and the center value is focused on the public good. This, of course, has required and continues to require a major realignment in all areas. And we've made fantastic progress in the areas of technology and some good strides in creating new economic models, good strides in creating legal constructs to support this notion, pretty good strides in building policies and having them articulated and implemented to support this notion, but we're still only part of the way there, right? We're still missing the critical mass of transformation that needs to happen. We're still requiring something very important to happen, and that's a massive and profound culture change, where we put our we switch the emphasis from talking about supporting open access and the public good as the core value, as the central construct of everything that we're doing in each of our stakeholder groups, and switch from just talking about it and realign our actions, our behaviors, the way that we work on a day-to-day basis with this at the center. And this isn't a small thing, right? This is something that it's been catalyzed, but it needs our individual commitments and our collaborative and collective commitments to realize this change. And we're not looking at a change, this is the thing I really want to emphasize, right? That life cycle of a social change movement, ours has happened pretty quickly, right? The BOAI was only 14 and a half years ago. We're at that end of the bureaucratization function, right? This stuff is happening in real time. The change that we need to catalyze isn't going to take 50, 75, 100 years to realize. These are changes that we can catalyze with changes in our behavior and our actions today. This is the really hard part, right? This is the crux of this notion of culture change that we're talking about. All of us in each of our stakeholder groups are talking about to certain extents, and we have been for quite some time. Now, I get that that sounds like, well, that's lovely, but it's really sort of abstract. What do you mean by converting actions? You know, you're talking to actions. How do you actually take a step that reflects truly making the public good at the center of the actions that you're doing? Well, I only had 30 minutes, so I'm only going to give one example, but I think this is a really great example. It's one that really opened my eyes from my stakeholder community to how making a small shift in your actions can actually have an enormous effect and illustrate, really intensely illustrate, I think, what this actually means. So MIT libraries are a member of SPARC. As I mentioned, we're a library membership organization. And MIT has been a phenomenal partner and an unbelievable leader in the open access movement since the inception. MIT has adopted open access principles across its campus. It has a strong open access policy. It's got an enormous commitment from the provost level down through many of the individual researchers levels to supporting open access. And the library is no exception, right? It's always been an incredibly outspoken and active supporter of open access. But what MIT has done that's different and that I really think illustrates this movement, this move, is that they recently underwent a strategic review of the library's sort of goals and missions, and commensurately its operations. The university goal for MIT sort of mirrors the goal of higher ed in the United States, and I would wager worldwide, which is the advancement and conveyance of knowledge. So the library's mission needs to feed into the overall goal of the university. And the libraries at MIT have articulated their primary goal as democratizing access to knowledge. Now, that's a very principle-based goal. That's a goal that is right in line with this notion of putting the public good at the center of research communication. And it's very interesting to think about, what does that mean for me as a library to democratize access to information, to have that as my mission? What are the actions that I can then take? What are the changes that I need to catalyze in my behavior to actually make this my operating reality, rather than something that I talk about on the side, or that I'm piloting, or having a test investment in? How do I put it at the center? What MIT did was something really kind of radical. They reorganized their library's activities in service of this mission. And that included putting its multi-million-dollar annual collections budget in service of its scholarly communications program and in service of its mission. What this means on a day-to-day basis is that, in essence, when you're making a decision now as the collections development librarian or the library staff about what resources, including journals, journal bundles, materials that we traditionally subscribe to, instead of saying, can I afford it? Does the dean of this department demand that I have it? The lens that they're making this decision through is, does this purchase further our mission of democratizing access to knowledge? And that equation is a very different equation when you're measuring, should I subscribe to a journal subscription package that has access and reuse restrictions on it? Is that democratizing access? Is that serving the mission of what it is that we have now declared is at the center of our actions and our opportunities? It's a subtle change, but it's a radical change, and it's a change that puts that value at the center of the decision-making process, where the locus of power is in this library, in the scholarly communications ecosystem, and that is its collection development budget, its multi-million-dollar budget. And the leadership at MIT, who I really just want to give a shout out to, Chris Borg, who's the fairly new director there, Ellen Finney, who's the ScholComm librarian there, and Greg Yao, who is the somewhat newish collection development person, have made this commitment, and I think they're setting a standard for us as individuals, as organizations, in just this one stakeholder community, to really see in action that we can consider taking, that makes more concrete this notion of putting this value at the center of our activities. And I love the fact that they've used the example of, they looked at the increasing willingness in this country in particular to switch from sort of mass-produced foods to the organic food industry. And they're looking at this as a way to vote with our collection dollars, right? To vote for a value with our collection dollars. And this notion of voting with your dollars for a value is the action that we're actually looking at taking. And this is a quote from Michael Pollan, who's a writer who's written extensively on the organic food movement, the in defense of food, the clean eating, healthy eating industry. And I love this, and this is actually an example that I give MIT full credit for raising this connection and using this as an effective analogy for how we might think about this, particularly in the library community, that you can either spend your dollars to support an industry devoted to quantity and convenience and a certain kind of value, or you can consciously make the decision to use those dollars in support of an industry organized around values that you collectively hold. And that's the big flip in my mind. We hear a lot in the open access movement right now about flipping this, flipping that, flipping subscriptions. We have to flip our actions into actions that support values versus actions that simply support something that someone else is telling us is of value. I think doing that will help position us as a movement to get much more traction to move effectively into the success phase of the open access movement. But individual actions, of course, alone won't carry the day. If MIT is alone in doing this, great, there'll be a lovely exemplar, but we won't see the kind of impact that we want to see. We need to have these actions done in a manner that's somehow coordinated in a much more meaningful way to fully leverage their effectiveness. And we've talked for a million years in this community, individually, collectively, about the notion of collective action, collaborative action, working together, banding together, and strength in numbers approaches, all of that kind of important, positive, and necessary coordination that we need to take. But I would also say we need to move beyond the notion of simply acting collaboratively or collectively. We have to think past collective action and into the notion of collective impact, right? Working together for the sake of working together in sort of smaller pockets is good. We should do it, but it alone isn't the answer. Collective actions can also be more effectively coordinated to give us a better chance as a movement to hit that success phase and to achieve that ultimate goal of the BOAI of a research communications ecosystem with the public good smack at the center. Now, I didn't invent the idea of collective impact. Those of you who are here from the funding community will be very familiar with this theory that has been talked about for about the last 5 years, I think mainly in the foundation and philanthropy community, as a way to coordinate individual actions that funders are seeding in different social change movements to give them a better opportunity to have the kind of impact that they want to achieve. This sort of illustrates the notion of collective impact. You can read up on it. There's loads of information on this from the Stanford School of Social Innovation, where I think it originated, and throughout the foundation community. This applies to where we are in our movement, right? This is another illustration, if we kind of break apart, thinking about the notion of where we started in the emergence phase, where there's just a lot of people with ideas that were not very coordinated, to people who began to get together and coalesce and think about ways to launch initiatives, to those initiatives then on individual basis saying, hey, maybe we should do something together, and really beginning to fly in the same direction, to the ultimate goal, which is it achievable? Maybe not to perfection, but we certainly can streamline and amplify our impact if we're not only moving in the same direction, but we're moving in the same direction really in support of that homogeneous, that shared, passionately shared end goal. So this is, fortunately, we're not the only movement to have come to the conclusion that we need some framework. We could use some help in figuring out how to move from where we are now, which is somewhere in between individual impact and some level of coordinated impact, into this notion of flying together in the right formation that gives us the strength that we need to hit success. This is not going to be a lecture on collective impact, I swear. This is the last slide, but I think this is very helpful. It's been a very helpful structure for us at SPARC and with many of our partners, again, to begin to think through about what does that mean? What do the structures, what are the conditions needed to get us from that fragmented stage that we sort of feel like we're in to this much more harmonized way of working and thinking together. And if you look at the conditions for effective collective impact, you have that common agenda and common goal at the top, right? Claudio was right. I mean, I will say this. So Claudio, you don't have to yell at me in the Q&A because I'm going to say it again. Claudio was right. That shared goal is really, really important for us to be able to articulate. Having a common agenda in support of that goal is also critically important. Having common progress measures, so we're not at the mercy of saying, oh shit, we didn't erode stock prices, so let's pack up the shop and go home. We're not at the mercy of feeling like that's the only measure of success that we have. We need to be able to articulate and work towards these shared measures. The most important thing, and the thing that we need to spend some serious time and effort working through together, is how do we put in the structure that's needed to effectively facilitate the ongoing, the continuous communications and coordination among what will have to be a the set of independently operating stakeholders that we have in the open access movement. This is the challenge, right? Thinking about putting in some sort of an organizational structure that is lightweight enough that we can live with it, but structured enough that it helps us with this continuous coordination and communication. That's not going to be easy for a movement that has prided itself from the get-go on having no leader, no central organization. Don't tell me what to do from, on high on a mountain as one organization. We're all in this together, and we all have our own individual ways of working. And that's great. That is why I'm here. I mean, I couldn't have it any other way. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't all benefit from working together to come up with some way to customize collective impact structure to help us increase our chances for success. It's a structure worth exploring, and it's something that I can look around the audience and I can say, we've talked about the need for something like this. We've talked about the need for something, some help in this arena. We haven't been able to articulate it, but it's something that I hope we'll spend some serious time in the next not too distant future figuring out how to do. In the meantime, while we figure that out, I want to close my talk with just a few words about one other smaller sort of strategy or exercise that we've found to be unbelievably helpful in SPARC in helping us to try to refocus our thinking and our efforts back onto the larger goal of the open access movement, back to that larger notion of the public good at the center of the research communication and scholarly communication system. We actually, about a year and a half ago, brought in an independent consultant who knew nothing about open access or the open access movement, but everything about movement organizing, and had some really good successes as a communications professional and as a movement organizer in a variety of different movements, and asked her to interview stakeholders within the movement, outside of the movement, and give us the honest, unvarnished feedback about how we were doing and articulating the goal, right? And this was, again, inspired by the notion that if someone like Claudio, who has spent a lot of time around our movement, doesn't know what the hell it is we're trying to achieve, then I think we may have a communications issue, at least on my end, because I've talked to him regularly, and I'm not getting the message across. What could help? What could help in this regard? One thing that the consultant found right away, and probably the most important thing for us, was that in the open access movement, we very, very often fell into the rhythm, the habit of talking about open access as if it were the end unto itself. Open access for open access's sake. It was almost like we were saying, we've got 5,000 open access journals, therefore all is well. This notion of stopping at open as the end game was not allowing us to A, articulate our goal clearly, and B, not allowing us to have the best chance of reaching the widest possible audience so that they could see themselves as an active beneficiary of and participant in the open access movement. And she encouraged us to think about this instead. Open in order to. Opening up access to materials in order to achieve a goal, right? That speaks perfectly to how we operate as a movement of very diverse stakeholders with very diverse interim goals and sub-goals, but ultimately all working towards this end game. Think about finishing the sentence, right, depending on your stakeholder group. Opening up access to articles in order to speed up research, progress towards curing Parkinson's disease, creating a sustainable agricultural mechanism, whatever the end game is that you or your stakeholder community is out to achieve. Open is a strategy that can help support it, not the end game in and of itself. Opening up access to research data to stave off a Zika pandemic. Opening up ACTS books. That's, Nicole, there's your new phrase for the open textbook movement, ACTS books. Opening up access to textbooks in order to make college more affordable to every student, right? All of these things, again, support the sub-goals, the interim goals that we should continue to push for and should continue to be of high importance to our stakeholder community, but as long as they feed into and are in harmony with the goal of the overall open access movement, open in order to create this research and scholarly communications ecosystem with the public good at the center. And as long as you can fill in the blank of your own sentence within the movement as opening up access to articles or whatever in order to, and it feeds into that larger mission of fueling the public good, of creating this ecosystem, then we have a nice lens in the interim to help determine what types of individual actions we can be taking, we should be taking. Filling in that blank seems to work in most cases. One thing I would ask us to think about is, does filling in the blank and finishing the sentence, with opening up access to articles in order to maximize profits to stockholders, does that fuel the public good? I mean, asking ourselves these hard questions, I think, will also help keep us on a path towards really effectively being able to articulate what fits in to this notion of a values-based system versus a value-based system as well. So the title, It's Not Easy Being Open, of this talk, you might say, why, what does that have to do with any of this? Honest to God, it was a placeholder. It was July. I wasn't sure what I was going to talk about, but nothing, I hope that nothing that I've said in the last 30 minutes runs contrary to this notion. It isn't easy being open, actually converting our support and our sort of philosophical and intellectual support for open into converting our organization's core behaviors and core functions into things that support the ultimate goal. And it's not easy being a social movement devoted to open access either. But what I hope I've at least been able to do is shed maybe just a little bit of light this morning that there are some structures, some strategies, some frameworks that we might want to consider working together to implement that can help prove that it's not easy being open, but it sure as hell isn't impossible either. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heather. Great organic food for thought.
Organic food for thought, yes.
Already this morning. We have time for questions and comments, yeah, and already
I couldn't
Claudio
see you. I was looking for you in the back. I'm sorry.
There are mics there. Please state your name, affiliation, and don't speak too fast, right? So, yeah.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Claudio Aspesi. I'm the person that Heather talked a lot about. Just two very quick comments. One, as an explanation, most of you were not in Paris 2 years ago. You did not have an opportunity to hear my presentation. I just want to explain one thing, which I think is important. I don't think for a moment that the share price of Wiley or Reed Elsevier should matter to you per se. And it was not my goal in that presentation to get the message across. I was just trying to put into perspective the numbers that Paul presented at the beginning, right? The growth of the movement is quite impressive, but bear in mind that if you really were taking over the world, you will not be seeing the share price of these companies continue to go up. There is some disconnect somewhere between the numbers you look at and the numbers other people look at as they view the whole system of scholarly communications. In fact, the goal that I had in Paris 2 years ago was exactly to say what you just heard, that there are disparate objectives, strategies, tactics. There's no leadership. If I came down from planet Mars and I said, take me to your chief of open access, there would be no one to call. So that was my first comment. Just want to make sure that you understand that you should not worry about the share price of Reed Elsevier, but you need to understand that the broader world looks at that. And in fact, as long as capital supports publicly listed for-profit companies which operate in this field, those companies will continue to have the resources to continue to do what they're doing in order to protect the status quo. Point number 2, the public good sounds very good. I'm afraid is too vague. I'm going to push back. I'm going to make myself the bad guy. I'm used to it anyway, and particularly when in this audience. I don't think it's enough. How will you know when you get there? How do you measure? How do you know that you won? What is public good? Let me be even more provocative. I think public good is actually impossible to define because the objectives are so disparate. Imagine for a moment, just painting a picture, imagine for a moment that 5 or 10 years from now, every single scholarly article is published in open access, in some shape or form, by the 3 large leading subscription publishers in the world today. And imagine that given their APC structure, pretty much the same budget that's spent today in buying subscriptions and collections is spent in supporting publication in open access. Will open access have failed? Depends, right? If the goal is to make the articles available to the largest number of people, to small and medium-sized companies, if it is to help cure Parkinson's disease, maybe the answer is yes. You may have succeeded under that definition. Is that success for all people in this room? Is that success for librarians if they don't have the money to spend money, if they continue to see the same cost inflation and they're not able to afford buying monographs and support other library activities as it has been their goal for many years now through open access? So I strongly encourage you to think very hard about goals which are measurable, actionable, and that really matter. I'm afraid that under public good, everyone will understand what they want to understand. It is vague enough that no one will be able to measure it anyway. And 5 years from now, when we'll hold this conference in Honolulu, I hope, we're moving west. I look forward to making the same comment at that point.
So I would just say I completely agree with you, and I do think that's why that notion of collective impact, which forces us to define common goals, the common goal, perhaps to a more granular level by articulating agreed upon performance measures, is a really important component. I do think that the public good is broad, but I actually would argue that it's a strength rather than a weakness of the goal, because it's an umbrella that's big enough to fit all of our individual stakeholder goals underneath. So I will look forward to refining our collective direction together towards this. Yes.
Yeah, we have
Dario.
a gentleman here.
Thanks, Heather. Dario from the Wikimedia Foundation. I really enjoyed your talk and your focus on what the actual purpose is of open access. And I wanted to partly challenge the idea that public good is something fuzzy. I mean, at Wikimedia, we have a pretty good idea of how we measure social good. And one quick suggestion I want to make to this group is that going forward, this community should probably try and invite and reach out more and more to consumers of open access, and people can do something. Just to answer your question, open for what? We have some pretty good answers, and I'm going to talk about some of them in my talk. Great. So inviting more people who can leverage open access, leverage your content, leverage your data is critical for your success, so you don't end up with proxies of success that are based on what the rest of the planet is thinking about.
That's a great comment. Thank you, Dario. And certainly Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation are phenomenal examples of people who take open content and do more than we ever, I think, originally even envisioned was possible with it. So, other questions? In the meantime, I just want to make sure there's a little advertisement here. There's more information on MIT's activities and a much better sort of exposition of the analogy of the organic food movement and MIT's actions in this blog called In the Open. It's a fairly new blog series. If you haven't logged onto it or subscribed to it, I would really encourage you not only to read the MIT blog, but the other really, really excellent blogs on the issues in the open access movement available there. So, yes.
I'm Greg Murray from Princeton Seminary, so in other words, a small specialized academic library. Regarding the stock price thing, I get the impression that, and I'm kind of new to all this, so this is, I get the impression that you're saying that, and others are saying that it's the fact that the stock prices of these big publishers have not been brought down several pegs, that this is an indication of a failure of this movement. In other words, it's a bad thing. Is that right?
I think there are some who were hoping that part of what the open access movement would achieve was the breaking, and okay, I'll just be blunt because I'm me, breaking sort of the stranglehold that a few commercial players have had on the journal publishing marketplace. That stranglehold comes sort of commensurate with very high profit margins. Those margins reflect in the stock price. So but breaking that stranglehold by any objective measure, one signal of success should be that they're not doing as well and we're doing better, right? So that is, I would say it's a signal. Does that help?
Yes. So is it also possible, or is it, as an alternative view, is it possible that this could be taken as a good thing in the sense that open access is not a dire threat to publishers, and that it's sort of an argument with publishers to say, we're not out to kill you or bring you down several pegs. It's more about if you just change your business models, everybody can win. Or is it the case that the profit margins are so egregious that that's just not possible? They have to get in line with some kind of normalcy or reality or realistic expectations.
I think what you've just said articulates where we are in the open access movement, right? If you ask any one of us in this room, you'll get some slightly different version of that answer to, hell no, those margins need to come down and those publishers need to be brought down, to you'd be a great political advocate because you can argue both ways on these kinds of things. So I do think that's actually an illustration of where we need a little bit better coalescence and agreement as a community on what's the answer to that question.
Great, thanks.
I'm going to play devil's advocate because I'm really on the outside of this argument, and it's the first time I have been at this meeting and heard the arguments from the open access community. And
Can you say who you are and who you are?
Oh, sure. Don Samuelak, President, U.S. Operations for Edited Cactus Communications. And so I'm on the service side, helping authors get published. We do a lot of translation and language editing. So what I'm hearing from a lot of the comments, and you know, it's just my personal opinion, I'm actually finding a little bit disturbing that open access is being defined more as us against them, when all along through the open access movement, my personal opinion was it was a redirection of the ship of scholarly publishing, where things are more accessible, discoverable, and open, which is a philosophy I can get behind.
Yeah.
I can't get behind the us versus them philosophy because really, from a commercial perspective, the us versus them means that we want, as an open access advocate, we want a piece of the big pie and we want to get rich.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what you're saying in a wolf in sheep's clothing. So that aspect is disturbing to me. If you stand there and you tell me that the open access movement is a movement to redirect scholarly communications so that everybody has access and is a level playing field, I'm absolutely on board. Mm-hmm. But I'm not on board with an us against them philosophy, and I find that actually quite disturbing. And because ultimately in an open access movement, it's the public who pays. It is there's only two purses of money: public funding, which is taxpayer dollar, and university funding, if it's not public funding through grants, is through tuition. So ultimately, the open access movement is pushing the whole cost of publishing on the public. And so when you do something like that, you have to be really concerned about the posture you're taking, because it could flip back on you if, in fact, this comes to light. And it is a commercial venture, and you need to be concerned in these regards.
Completely take those comments to heart.
Yeah, this will be the last question in this session.
Bob
Okay.
gets the last word.
I'm Bob Schatz. I'm with the Open Research Group at Springer Nature, and my intent is not to paint a big target on myself, so. But I'm a librarian who works in a for-profit organizations, and I'm not going to paint either side as being lily white or the ultimate ideal, but I'm just going to ask the question. One comment and one question. The comment is that let's not overlook that these commercial enterprises are a source of tremendous growth of open access publishing. So it's not like commercial publishers have resisted or certainly have gotten past the very early days of trying to do in open access. It's been embraced, and it's a huge area of growth. I'm just going to ask the question that I wonder if organic food conferences set as a goal to that Whole Foods should make less money. So I'm just going to put that out there.
Never having attended one, but really would like to now. I'm betting no, but I would also say that those last two comments really do speak to the heart of why I continue to think it's incredibly important for us to use the public good as the lens through which we view success of the open access movement. If the business practices of a company that can make a 42% profit margin on publicly funded research can be argued credibly to be serving the public's interest, the public's good, then hey, I'm all for it and I'd like to be the president of that company. If we're stretching ourselves into pretzels to make that argument, then I would say it's the responsibility of all players in the open access movement, commercial, not-for-profit, library, university-based, funder, student, researcher, to ask ourselves those questions and to be honest about the answers that we're giving, about our contributions, our actions, our role in the movement. So thank you all again very much for having me here today.
Yeah, please join me in showing our appreciation of Heather's contribution here.